Well, a long day, huh? But we're very, very blessed to have one more opportunity to hear a fantastic keynote speaker. I'm very lucky to know him, and I'll tell you a little bit about him. I would read his bio, but we would be here for another 2 hours. It's quite lengthy, the things that Mr. Selingo has done. But Jeff Selingo is going to join us today to talk about the future of higher education. He's been a prolific writer about higher ed, particularly in the U.S., for the last 2 decades. He's an author of 2 New York Times best-selling higher education books. They're available on Amazon, I believe, if you want to go find those. Little pop for you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah. He's a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and occasionally to his former employer, the Chronicle of Higher Education. You will find him serving some time as the special advisor to Arizona State University, where he is the founding director of the Academy for Innovative Higher Education Leadership, which is a partnership between Arizona State and Georgetown, a really phenomenal program. He's also a visiting scholar at Georgia Tech University, where he teaches ed leadership with the 21st Century Universities collaboration that they have there. So you can imagine that Jeff has very little time, but he still has a loving wife and 2 young daughters in D.C., and he spends an enormous amount of time with them, and so I admire him for being able to do that and everything else he does. And so that wasn't enough for him, and he recently decided that aside from being a LinkedIn influencer, and one of those few people that I know that are Twitter verified, he also has started a podcast called Future You. And I believe it's at Future You Podcast. Is that right? Yeah, the Twitter handle for that. So go follow that one. But he's an expert in scale, talking about scale in higher education and how we do that. He's an expert in how we think about innovation. He thinks about the future of work and how we align the work that we do at our institutions with employment, and certainly speaks very often about how we might collaborate in the future and what we do today, both good, bad, right, and wrong. I consider him a true leader in higher ed in a sense that not many people are. He's a fantastic teacher, and I am very happy to call him my friend. So with that, I will get out of his way and let him talk to you about the future of higher education.
Thanks, Kevin. I think I'm going to take you on the road with me after that introduction. It's great to have you, to be with you today, and thanks for lasting all day to get to this point. As Cameron mentioned, I've written a couple of books in the last couple of years. The most recent of which is There Is Life After College, which talks about the transition from university to the workforce, and why that is so much more difficult for graduates today than it was even 10, 20 years ago. And when you write a book about that transition from higher education into the economy, into the workforce, into that first job, you tend to think about your own transition when you were in your own 20s. So when I was in my 20s, and a couple weeks after I graduated from the university, I went out to Phoenix, Arizona, where I had a summer fellowship at the Arizona Republic. Now this is in 1995, and I showed up in the newsroom on the first day, and I was assigned to the business desk, the business section of the newspaper. And the business editor looked at me and she said, "Well, you are young, you must know something about technology. Our technology reporter is on leave for the summer. You're now our technology reporter." Now, 1995, many of you in this room, I think from looking at you, probably remember that period of technology. The year before, the first commercial web browser was launched. And so I spent the summer explaining the internet to people. So I wrote an entire story about internet cafes, those weird places, if you remember, you used to go to sign on to the web using those big desktop computers. I wrote a story about the first airline on the internet, which was Southwest Airlines. Now you can look up the timetable, but you still had to call them up to actually make a reservation. And I wrote an entire story about the letters www. And so why do I tell you this story? I tell you this story because in many ways, little did I know that in 1995, within 10 years of writing those stories about this thing called the internet, it would totally disrupt the industry that I was in, which was journalism. Within 10 years, half the number of people were employed in 2005 as were employed in 1995 in journalism. And we see that in industry after industry, including higher education. But for the most part, for all the talk about disruption and how the digital economy is changing higher education, when you compare it to other sectors of the economy, in many ways, we're still in the very early stages of responding to this digital disruption. Now, as you know, and in many of your countries and in many of your institutions, market forces are now bearing down on higher education as we shift from a global information economy to a global digital economy. In many ways, we're seeing many of the same forces that we saw in higher education hundreds of years ago as we moved from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. And when we moved last century from that industrial economy to an information economy. In many ways, I think higher education is entering a very new era in its modern history. And when I think of the modern history of higher education, I think of essentially from the 1960s when there was worldwide growth in colleges and universities around the world. And indeed, that was really the first period of huge growth around the world in higher education. We saw in most countries enrollment grow, institutions grow, government funding grew in this period as more and more people saw getting a university degree as equaling success in the job market, as necessary for a job. And we also saw, as a result, increased government spending. And that period lasted until about 1990 or so, when we saw some downturns in demographics around the world that led to a decline in some countries of higher education enrollments. And then we moved into what I call the tech era. Now, we think we're living in the tech era now, but in many ways, this was the original tech era. Because in 1994, when we had the first commercial web browser, we moved into an era of how can we use this in the classroom in teaching and learning. We saw the development of course management tools and things like Blackboard and other companies started to grow up around this time. And in the late 1990s, we saw a huge growth around the world in online education that continued through the 2000s. The global economic crisis of 2008, I think, really changed this. And we saw again yet more questioning around the value of higher ed, which leads us now into the era I think we're firmly planted in, that started earlier this decade. And it's marked by declines in enrollment, at least in face-to-face students in many countries, increased questions about the value and the return on investment of degrees, questions from governments about funding higher education. And I'm not quite sure what to call this era, but I'm going to call it the collaboration era. Because in many ways, I think it signals to us in higher education that we can no longer act alone, that we need to work much more with industry and other stakeholders as we try to design not only a curriculum for the future, but how do we continue to allow our institutions to survive and thrive in this new era. And I think it's really going to require us to think much differently rather than just hunker down. When I talk to presidents in the US in particular, they all tell me, well, if we could just go back to the way it was in the 1960s in terms of funding, right? They think if we just get through this next year and the year after that, and it always ends up being the year after that, we're going to be much better. But this is why I'm in many ways bullish on the future of higher education, because I think this deeper cooperation and networking of universities, much deeper cooperation than we've had in the past, is really going to help us survive and thrive. Now, today, I want to talk about three big issues when we think about the future of higher education. As I mentioned, I'm a journalist by training, so I tend to think of these issues in terms of questions. And I want to talk to us about what we're going to learn in this future. What is the future of learning going to be, and what does it need to be given the massive shifts we're seeing in the economy around the world? Who are our learners going to be, and where and when are we going to learn in this future economy? I want to diagnose kind of what's emerging, some of the issues that are emerging, and then I'll spend a little time at the end outlining potential solutions, some of which are already working at universities that I have visited. And then we'll have some time at the end to talk more specifically. So what we learn is, you know, in most of your jobs and in most of your institutions, the churn of knowledge to keep up in any job is increasingly moving at a faster rate. IBM estimates that the amount of knowledge in the world is doubling every 18 months. And as the Internet of Things grows, it's going to move even faster. Entire occupations around the world are expanding and contracting at an alarming pace, right? Even things like medicine and accounting and law, things that we used to tell young adults to go into because they were pretty steady career tracks, are changing in ways that many of us don't understand. There's this study by Oxford that came out a couple of years ago that talked about the emergence of artificial intelligence and automation, and how that's going to lead to 50% of job losses over the coming decades, particularly in things that can be automated. And I was just at an artificial intelligence conference last week, and a number of artificial intelligence computer scientists were talking about how we now, just in the last couple of years, computers are much better at seeing and hearing humans, right? Think about things like self-driving cars, and even though they don't tend to work as well as we think they work these days, self-driving cars and other personal assistants, and how they can hear and see us. And thus, it's going to allow automation now to take jobs that used to go to college graduates, like accountants. For some reason, we could train them to be accountants. We could train computers to be accountants, but not athletic trainers. The one that really worries me, since I fly a lot, is the one in the middle. There's something about having a human being in that pilot that makes you feel better. But as a result, we really need to rethink how we prepare students for this future workforce. You know, technology is not new, right? Going back to the Industrial Revolution, technology replaced jobs. Technology has always replaced jobs throughout human history. But what has also been true in this long race between technology and education, education has always won, right? The way to kind of keep up and keep ahead of technology was to get more education, go back and get more degrees. And it's why in many of our countries we've seen a huge increase in enrollment at colleges and universities over the last several decades. But what's not clear is whether that's going to continue to be true, as computers tend to do jobs better than humans in some ways. And that's the question, I think, on many of our minds. And so the challenge to us, I think, is how do we help students complement rather than try to compete with technology in the future? And I think this is going to be the key. How do we help them navigate this world so that they complement rather than compete with technology? And I think it's going to require us to rethink how we operate at the undergraduate, at the graduate level, at the administrative, and at the faculty level in the decades ahead. So as Cameron mentioned, over the last couple of years, I've spent time on the road as I reported this most recent book. And I spent time with employers of all kinds and all sizes, including some of the hottest tech companies in Silicon Valley, some other companies that tend to hire college graduates every year, nonprofits, governments, large and small. Multinational companies, although most of them located in the US. And what I found is that despite this, there's always a talk of a skills gap, right? We have all these jobs that need to be filled, and our colleges and universities are not graduating enough students to fill those jobs. But what I found is that the real skills gap is in the soft skills, not necessarily the hard technical skills. What do I mean by the soft skills? Skills like communication, teamwork, problem solving, right? Not certain hard skills that we hear often about. Those are the skills that employers most want out of today's university graduates and most often not getting. And what I heard from those employers and what I saw in the interviews I sat in on over the last couple of years is mirrored in the findings from Burning Glass Technologies of an analysis that they did of job ads in industries around the world. So Burning Glass is a company out of Boston, Massachusetts, and what they do is they analyze both job ads and resumes around the world to try to find trends in the job market. And in most cases, they're kind of ahead of government agencies who are trying to do this because they're looking at it in real time. And so what Burning Glass did a couple of years ago is they scraped data from 20 million online job ads. 20 million online job ads around the world in all different kinds of industries for all different kinds of jobs. And what they wanted to know is, what are the skills that get you in the door? Right? What are the skills that get you in the door? Now, as you know, if you've ever applied for a job, which I'm assuming most of you had or have, or if you've ever advertised for a job, you don't list every skill you need, right? You only list the skills that you normally don't get or that are absolutely critical to doing that job. And so what Burning Glass found when they scraped these job ads is they found that in 3 out of every 4 job ads, the same 25 skills kept appearing over and over again. These were 20 million job ads in all different industries, all different job categories. And what surprised them was, when they looked more closely, is how the top 5 in particular were very similar. Indeed, things like communication and writing, organizational skills, customer service and problem solving, planning and being detail oriented, right? Many of the things that we think of as these soft skills, right? These ability to communicate and work in teams and problem solve. There was really only one really technical skill in the top 5, and that's that little icon in the middle, Microsoft Excel, right? So as I tell people, as long as you know Excel, you're going to be kind of golden in this job market. Now, why, at the bottom of all these ads, they also asked for a university degree. So they were asking for these skills that they used to think were embedded in the university degree, and they specifically were now calling out for these skills because they no longer trusted them to be embedded in that degree. And indeed, what we're seeing around the world is that even as countries, and I know this is happening in the US in particular, even as countries stress STEM degrees, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. Here's the myth. Nearly all the job growth, this is a study that comes from David Deming at Harvard University, has been in occupations that have high demand for social skills, while jobs that require high levels of analytical and mathematical reasoning have actually fared pretty poorly in this economy. In other words, it's not an either or. Right? We have this debate in many countries and at many institutions between the practical skills and the liberal arts skills, between the math and science and the humanities. And what this study shows is that job success in the future and navigating this economy and complementing technology rather than trying to compete with it is going to require a mix of both the social and soft skills as well as the hard skills. In many ways, the workforce that our students are entering in this decade ahead look like a preschool classroom, right? Where things like curiosity, sharing, and negotiating are front and center, right? And then for some reason, in our schooling systems, in most countries, we move from that kind of play-based, project-based learning, and we move into kind of giving them a script to follow, which doesn't allow them to exercise those soft skills over and over again. So I was reporting the book. I spent a lot of time in preschool classrooms because my daughter, at the time, my oldest daughter, who's now 8, was 5 years old at the time, and she was going into kindergarten. And at the school that she was at, they were going through a massive remodeling project. And instead of, and they had all these products that they were putting into the classroom, furniture and computers and so forth. And instead of moving those cardboard boxes off to the recycling bin, they decided to put them into an empty classroom and let the students loose for the day to play with those cardboard boxes. Now, my daughter came home from school that day, and for about the week after, she couldn't stop talking about what could be made with a bunch of cardboard boxes. They made a train station, they made a school, they made a town. And they did this all while negotiating among themselves, right? It was the creativity of 5-year-olds to do this. Now, I was pretty excited about this because it was a couple weeks before Christmas, so I told my wife, I said, oh, I guess we don't have to buy her any toys. We could just buy her cardboard boxes because she'll be great. But then I started to go out to universities to start reporting the book right after Christmas. And I spent time with professors and people running career services and administrators. And at some point, at some of these places, the conversation would turn to my kids, and I would tell them this story about her building these cardboard towns and so forth. And some of them laughed, especially the professors, because we started talking about what would happen if we put a bunch of 18-year-old and 20-year-olds in the same room, right, with a bunch of boxes. Now, they would probably ask a lot of questions. That's my daughter's preschool class. They would ask a lot of questions, right? But it would all be about process, not about possibilities, right? Not about what could be created. It would be things about what's the assignment, when do we need to finish, do we need to work in teams? And the number one question most students ask when given any assignment, how are we going to get graded on this, right? And this is what's happening now. In many ways, our education system around the world is like the workplace of old, right? Where things like punctuality, attention to detail, and following a script was valued above all else. In many ways, some of our universities are like this, right? Students come in, they follow a course catalog, they pick their courses, they get a syllabus that tells them what to read, what to do at every week of the semester. Someone is directing learning for them. And then they get out into the workforce. And as we know, the workforce is a mashup of activities with no scheduled end. And the people who are hiring them see this. So John Lutner, the head of global learning at Xerox, the former head of global learning at Xerox, told me that the graduates he was hiring know how to take a course, but they really need to learn how to learn. Now, John was responsible a couple of years ago for revamping the professional development education at Xerox around the world. So Xerox used to bring its employees to various places to various locations around the world to do professional development every year. And a couple of years ago, they decided to stop that, and they moved all of their most of their professional development online. They have 10,000 courses now online because they saw what we're seeing, right? The knowledge was moving so quickly that they couldn't keep up by just bringing in people once a year, for example. So when he did that, he decided to take a survey of employees to figure out what they wanted out of their professional development. And one of the groups he surveyed was their new employees who were college graduates. And when he asked them, what's the number one professional development opportunity you want out of our company? Their answer was time management. Time management. Because for the first time in their lives, somebody, a parent, a teacher, a syllabus, a course catalog, something wasn't directing learning for them. He was shocked, right? And that's when he discovered that we needed to rethink how we're educating students. And in many ways, as Rick Setterstein, who's a professor at Oregon State University, told me, right, there's all these things that happen at a university that happen outside the classroom that are critically important to developing these soft skills that are so absolutely needed, right? The network effects of the residential campus, right? When I asked students how they got a job, or graduates how they got a job, or how they got that internship, or how they got that apprenticeship, I was always told somebody else told them, right? Another student, right? And the transfer of learning that happens between courses and between the classroom and what happens outside the classroom. Too much of what's happening on colleges and universities today are happening in a silo. And this is why I think we're about to enter this collaboration era. Because the big challenges that we face can't be solved in a silo, right? How we feed this planet, how we provide it with water and energy and climate change, and even the future of work itself, is a cross-disciplinary problem that needs to be solved by people across campuses, across disciplines, across majors. Now, not only is learning changing, but a new generation of students are arriving at our campuses as the next generation moves into their careers, right? So most of the students entering our universities born in the 1990s, and we're really starting to see the pathway of these students be very different, right? The students that are graduating from our universities today are entering a job market and navigating a job market that is very different than the one of even 10, 15 years ago, and is much more treacherous in many ways. Now, this is a stat that comes from the United States, but it's increasingly true around the world. The average age of financial independence for college graduates in the US is now 30. 30. That's a point, and this comes from the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, that's the point when they reach the median wage, and if they have debt from higher education, when they paid it off. So that's increased from the age of 26, right? 26 back in 1983. And what's happening, and now we know this is a worldwide phenomenon, what's happening is that students are coming out of university, entering the workforce, and many of them are getting jobs that don't require a university diploma, right? They're underemployed. So a study that just came out in the US a couple of weeks ago showed that about 43% of American college graduates are underemployed, meaning they're in jobs that don't require a university diploma. Now, we all think that, oh, that's fine, as long as, they'll just be in that job for a couple of months and they'll eventually get a job that is college, that is necessary, a college degree is necessary. And indeed, when I was editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education, I used to have these university presidents come through my office, and they would always say, well, we don't prepare students for their first job, we prepare them for their fifth job. I always wondered who prepared them for their first or fourth job, but anyway. But what we're finding is that that first job after the university, and again, this is a US statistic, but I think this is increasingly true around the world now, is incredibly important, because what this study found from the Strada Institute for the Future of Work is that while 43% of new college graduates are underemployed, 5 years later, 29% are still underemployed, and 10 years later, 21% are still underemployed, right? So that it's not just a slight detour. In many ways, it could be a permanent detour. Now, I wanted to find out, when I was reporting the book, There is Life After College, I wanted to find out, okay, who are these students, right? Why do some students launch from the university in a great way? They get a job, they start a company, they're entrepreneurial in many ways, and others really struggle. And so what we did is we took a survey of people in their mid-20s. We did a survey of people between 25 and 27. And we wanted to know, if we reverse engineered their career going back to the age of 18, what did they do to get to where they are today? And we found in that survey, and if you read the book, I go into a lot more detail about these groups of people. We found that people launch into their careers out of education in one of three ways. They're either sprinters, they're wanderers, or they're stragglers. Sprinters kind of jump right in. Those are the people that go right on to graduate school or professional school, or they have a job already lined up before they graduate from the university. Wanderers kind of take their time. If they wandered through higher education, if they wandered through the university, they tend to wander afterwards, and usually it takes mid-20s or later to kind of get going. Stragglers, they really press pause on most of their 20s, and it's that 30th birthday kind of staring them in the face. And many times, they never even finish a credential. They drop out before they finish the credential. Now, we found that about 2/3 in the US of college graduates or college people in their mid-20s fall into those later two categories. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with not launching right after the university, but the problem is that in many places, the only on-ramp to careers is through education. And if you miss that on-ramp, or you get off of it for a little while, it's sometimes hard to get back on. And so as universities, we need to think about that. And what we found is, well, why did some people end up in the first bucket and others ended up in the second and third bucket? And we found that there were three factors in particular that led students to end up in one of these three buckets. The first was debt. How much debt did they have to go in to pay for their education? The more debt they had to take on, the less likely they were to launch well after college. Why is that? Because they had to make career decisions based on how much debt they had, right? They couldn't move to expensive cities. They couldn't take jobs that had great advancement opportunities if it didn't pay enough. We know from data that has come from Gallup that entrepreneurship is very low among people who have high levels of debt coming out of universities. So they had to make that choice. Second, were internships, co-ops, apprenticeships, any sort of experiential project-based learning. Absolutely critical. And what I found, and this is particularly true of most big companies now, most large companies, 75% or more of their hiring pool now comes from their intern pool. In other words, if you don't intern there, you're never going to get a job there. And so what we found, for example, that the sprinters, much more likely to have interned and now working where they interned compared to the other two groups. This was really an aha moment for me in reporting the book. And what I found was that companies love internships, going back to what I was talking about earlier, because they don't trust those soft skills to be embedded in the degree. And the great thing about an internship is it's a great way to really interview and test somebody over a couple of months rather than just try to interview them over a couple of hours. And then finally, we also discovered that the credential itself is absolutely critical, right? Many of these students were dropping out of the university without ever getting that credential, and thus they didn't really have any signaling power. They didn't have any power in the job market. So what we discovered through this survey and through the work that I was showing earlier around underemployment is that it doesn't actually matter as much as we think it does that you actually go to college and get that piece of paper, as it matters about what you do while you're there, right? How you go to the university, the experiential learning you get, the engagement with your studies, the life at the university, the faculty mentors that you have are much more critical to your life after the university than where you go. And this to me is a big change over the last couple of decades, because I think the story that we have sold to most students is as long as you get that piece of paper, you're golden in the job market. And I think what's different now is that the piece of paper matters, but what matters a lot more to employers and in this job market is how they go to college, is those experiences that they have that help them navigate this new economy. So indeed, I think how we think about the physical dimension of education in the future is going to shift. And this is the last topic I want to cover and talk a little bit about what's happening everywhere else before we take some questions, right? So this is the way we used to think about learning around most of the world, right? When we think of school, school is something that happens to young people, and it usually happens in a physical place, and it happens one or two times in life, right? It's episodic. Even if you go back to school, you go back later in your life, and you might go back to the university to get another degree, but it's episodic. We're now moving, in my mind, into an era of lifelong, continuous learning, right? As Cameron mentioned in my intro, I'm a visiting scholar at Georgia Tech, the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, and we just finished a 18-month project where we talked about this idea of the Georgia Tech commitment to lifelong education. The idea is that you no longer are going to enroll in the university, but you're now going to associate with it for the rest of your life, right? So that rather than be conceived just solely as a physical place, one enters at one point in life and then leaves 4 years later, it's now going to be a platform for lifelong learning. We're already doing this, right? Think about how most of us learn on a daily basis, right? Every year when Google comes out with its top searches around the world, the first dozen or so are all how to do something, right? How to do something. Every time we are learning in the moment and we're applying it at that moment. This is the idea of continuous learning, where we're not going to be constantly going back for this episodic learning. And what's happened is that a number of new entities have grown up. A number of new providers have grown up over the last couple of years to provide this continuous learning to university graduates, right? Places like edX and Coursera, which are the two big MOOC providers, and General Assembly, which provides courses that last anywhere from a couple of hours to 11 weeks. And to me, they will own this, right? These outside educational providers will own this new learning economy unless universities act to do it themselves, right? These are bit players today, but many more are getting into this world, right? So for example, LinkedIn. LinkedIn bought lynda.com a couple of years ago for $1.7 billion, right? And then they launched LinkedIn Learning. What does LinkedIn Learning do, right? So if you have a LinkedIn profile, it knows all the skills you have, and it knows the jobs you're looking for, and it has the jobs on one side, the skills on the other side, and then it starts suggesting courses in the middle that you could take to fill that skills gap. And then even Facebook now is thinking about getting into this business. This, to me, this idea of lifelong continual education is not only a huge market, but it's a huge need in this new economy. And if higher education doesn't think beyond the silos of students that it has always served, this is going to be a market that's going to be served by somebody else. So what should we do? What should higher education do as we think about this future? I want to put out a couple of ideas, and then we could do some Q&A with Cameron. First, we need to kind of rethink the legacy structures that we have, right? Think about all the things you do on your campuses because you've always done them, right? I know in the U.S. we have a lot of traditions, right? We have traditions, and we have semesters, and we have that are 14, 15, 16 weeks. We take nice breaks around Christmas. We take nice breaks over the summer. We have 3 credit courses. We have degrees that are 120 credits. We have all of these traditions and legacies that have lasted for generations. But finally, we're thinking in new ways, right? We're thinking in new ways. There's all these new conversations happening, particularly in the US, around things like nano degrees and micro-credentials that are shorter than the full credential as we think of it today, right? There's things that we're talking about, these mini-mesters, right? Arizona State, where I work, has these mini-mesters. Their typical semester is 15 weeks. They have these mini-mesters that are 8 weeks long that allow students to mix and match and get that experiential learning that they absolutely need. And we're seeing how it's working, right? Georgia Tech launched one of these micro-credentials a couple of years ago, an online master's degree in computer science for $7,000, right? Online master's degree for $7,000 from one of the best science and technology universities in the world. Now, when they launched this, there were a lot of skeptics on campus, because I was there. There were a lot of skeptics on campus, and they said, well, it's going to take away from it's going to affect quality, and it's going to take away from our on-campus program, which costs, by the way, a lot more. And what they found when they did a study of it is that it actually increased the number of students going for a computer science degree by 8%. By 8%, this one program alone. Because what happened was there was this huge demand for a less expensive, high-quality online degree that wasn't being served by anybody else. And this, to me, is the challenge, but the opportunity that we have in front of us. Right? When we think about our legacy degrees, right, and everything that we do on campuses, there's all these new markets that we could be serving in new ways for this new economy. The second thing is the university for life, right? I talked about this idea of continuous learning. So if we're going to be learning throughout our lifetime, if I think fewer people are going to be following kind of that episodic learning that we've done through generations. This idea, we go to school, we spend a couple of years there, we come out, we go get a job, we come back, we get another degree perhaps, right? If that's going to be happening, how do we move to this platform for lifelong learning? Now, this is a challenge that Stanford University actually tried to solve a couple of years ago. They put out this thing called the Open Loop University, their design school. And the idea behind it was that when students apply for admission to Stanford University at the age of 18, instead of applying and getting accepted for 4 years, they get accepted to 6 years, and here's the key, they could use that any time throughout their life. Now, you could Google this for more information, but it's 2025 was their plan to try to implement this. And what they're thinking is that you could come in, you could take 2 years, you could go out, you could work for a startup, a tech startup, and when that fails, you could come back and do another 2 years. Or maybe you could do 4 years, and then you still have another year a year or 2 years on that clock in your 30s or your 40s. It's going to be critically important in this economy that we help students have these opportunities, right? Because more and more of us are going to be working in this freelance economy, in this gig economy. We know that in many countries, that's where most of the growth in the job market is. Right now, people are going to be working for themselves. Cameron read my bio. I work mostly for myself. And if you think about it, most learning after higher education, after universities, has been directed by employers, right? Every year, they would meet with their employees. They would talk to them about their learning needs. They would talk to them about their professional development. In many cases, they would suggest courses to them, and they would even, in some cases, pay for it. But what happens if people work for themselves? Who directs that learning for them? And in many cases, I think this, again, is a great opportunity for universities to continue advising that they're already doing at the undergraduate and graduate level and continue that throughout their lifetime. And then we could own that learning. The learner, him or herself, could own that learning. There's this great project happening at MIT around using blockchain technology, which I don't quite understand, except that I know I probably should have invested in Bitcoin a long time ago. But that this idea that we can now certify, potentially, learning that happens everywhere at any time, and that the owner would own this data, right? And this data could be certified and it can be used. Because right now, when you think about it, the transcript, the diploma, is owned by the university giving it out, right? And they keep possession of that, essentially, right? But what happens if we're going to be learning throughout our lifetime, and how are we going to certify that? How are we going to justify that when we go out onto the job market? And then finally, I think that we need to rethink education out of the silos I was talking about earlier. And I call this hybrid education, this idea that we need to have both hands-on technical education as well as a broad liberal arts education. Because as I showed you earlier, all the job growth is in jobs that require both social skills as well as technical skills. It's not an either or. This picture behind me is from Shinola, which is a company out of Detroit. And they make watches, they make wallets, they make leather products. They were started in Detroit about 10 years ago. And they're housed in a building that housed an old General Motors research and development operation. And what's interesting about this building, it's a huge building, 9 stories, hundreds of thousands of square feet. What's interesting about this building is that it has a school, it has a university, and it has Shinola, the company, both its manufacturing and its other employees, all co-located together, so that students can see what they're learning and how it applies in the job market. And this, to me, is the type of collaboration that we're going to need to have in the future. We can't act alone. Now, in many ways, I think as we hear about these changes coming to higher education, it's kind of very easy to dismiss them, right? I sat in rooms very much like this back in the late 1990s, and somebody was talking about, someday somebody will want to read a newspaper on a desktop computer. Little did we know that we would be reading, newspapers on devices as small as this, right? When people said, oh, well, you're going to be jumping in cars driven by strangers that you're going to be, asking for on a device like this, or you're going to be staying in people's rooms that you're going to request online through something called Airbnb, we all thought they were crazy, right? And in many ways, we tend to overestimate the speed of change, right? We all think the sky is going to fall tomorrow, but we underestimate the depth of change. And that's why in my own industry, we kind of laughed off this idea that people would want to read news on devices as small as this. And this is why I think it's absolutely critical that we work together to help students complement rather than compete with the technology that we're going to be facing in the future. Thank you very much for your time today. It was really great to be with you. And I'm now going to turn it back to Cameron.
Wow. That's That's a lot of stuff to cover, right? And I know that we've got just a little bit more time. We're right between you and some cocktails, so we won't go too long here, but we've got a few folks with some questions, and I see a hand in the back there. But I'm going to ask Jeff a couple quick questions, and then if you raise your hand, someone with a mic will come and find you, and we can go from there, okay? So Jeff, I do have a challenge for you. I mean, next time you do this presentation, I'd like for you to talk about Lehigh and its blockchain effort, because we're going deep with it.
Are you? Okay.
Yeah, we are. No, we're actually thinking about how do we recognize the out-of-classroom skills, the soft skills.
That's great.
In a compelling way, and the internships, the experiential.
Okay.
So beyond just the classroom. But I don't have a fancy graphic like MIT. But
to work on that.
But that prompted me to think about I wonder if you have some ideas of either innovative presidents or innovative institutions that we don't always talk about. We always talk about Stanford and MIT, and we like to follow those schools. But I think there's some folks, at least in the U.S. or maybe even internationally, that we can learn a lot from.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two that I will highlight, one from Canada and one from the U.S. One is one that I work with, is Arizona State University, which has grown by leaps and bounds over the last couple of decades, largely because of its president who's been there for 15 years, who really thought that scale matters to do a lot of these things. And whether it's using technology, whether it's online education, whether it's blended classrooms, or whether it's this other type of work around new degrees and new ways of thinking about the curriculum, I think that's one example. The other example is Waterloo in Canada, which I think has really set the standard for this idea of a blended hybrid education between the doing and the classroom experience. And you know, those students there spend much of their time outside the classroom in co-ops. And I think that to me is a model of learning while you're doing, learning in real time. So for example, one of the things Arizona State is experimenting with now is a project-based degree, where more than half the credits actually happen outside the classroom in projects. And I don't know if you saw this presentation when you were at ASU, but the theory behind it comes from learning science, in that we learn best when we're able to apply it almost immediately, right? Think about when you need to do something new. If you learn it and then you try to apply it 3 years later, like we tend to do in higher education, you're not going to remember it. So the idea that project-based learning and combining kind of that hands-on learning and the broad classroom learning, I think is absolutely critical, and that's one of the reasons why I like Waterloo.
Yeah, really interesting to think about how higher ed and place-based higher ed remains the validator of quality, right, of education. So I know I had a question in the far back, and then I've got one right over here. Let's go here first, and then I think that's Todd back there.
Yeah, and then we have one over here too.
Okay. Yeah, do you have a mic here?
Yeah, one's coming right down. This is why technology is not the future of higher ed. So.
Thank you very much indeed. My name's Andy Panaluna. I'm here from the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education. And a lot of what you say resonates a lot with what we're doing, and also a lot with the work I'm doing in Europe and with the OECD. Here in the UK, The Economist example reports about life-wide learning, not just lifelong. So it's where do you learn, how do you learn? And a lot is being discovered that creativity, for example, is being learned outside of the education system. In the US, there's a famous piece, 2012, I think, The Creativity Crisis, and it's in the schools. I don't know if people here are familiar with it, but 250,000 pupils, net result was the IQ went up 1.3, and the creativity index drops 20% in 20 years. So this is the raw material that's coming into learning institutions. If that is the case, I would support it with OECD work as well. What does that mean to HE when they're trying to deal with people who already perhaps lower down that creativity scale than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure you can do remedial creativity at that point. And I think it makes it even more critical then for universities to try to create spaces that allow students to be creative, right? And to, whether it's entrepreneurship programs, whether it's project-based learning, I think it's absolutely critical then you get them outside of that classroom environment so that they have that creativity. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to do, at least in the US, is that I think we need to redesign the latter years of high school, particularly the senior year, because it's kind of a wasted year in my opinion. And I think that we can actually get a head start on some of these things for higher education. But it's a real issue, and and I see this. As I mentioned, I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old at home, and they still love going to school, and they still see it as a very creative process. But I know there's going to be a day pretty soon where that flips, and that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, really compelling to think about higher education as a continuum and not just, just the 4 years or 6 years you spend with us. Dr. Davey.
Yeah, hello. My name's Todd Davey. I'm an associate professor at the Institute MIN Telecom Business School in France. Jeff, thank you very much for your presentation. Really enjoyed it. I had a bit of a question going around in my head when I was listening to it, because I think there's a comment that you made that came up quite regularly, which is there's a very clear driver in the US for change, and that is to do with student debt. I think it came up a number of times in your presentation. Obviously, revolving around the fact that a degree program, whether it's a bachelor or a master's degree, might cost somewhere between $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 US. What I've been wondering about myself, because I've been working and living in Europe for now 11 years, and I've been wondering, what is the driver that's going to cause change in a European environment? Because outside of the UK, what we have is a situation where there's a lot of, generally speaking, it's state-funded higher education. And so my question to you is, I'm not sure how much experience you've had with the European environment, but I'm just wondering, what is going to be the driver for change in the European environment, in your opinion?
Well, don't you think that and I guess this is our question back to you, is that generous funding going to continue in all these European countries as they face the demographic challenges that much of the world is facing, particularly as you have a growing population that's getting older, that's going to require more public resources, that's not going to necessarily support resources. I mean, we saw this in the US. I mean, one of the reasons why student debt is increasing is because public financing is decreasing. And public financing started to decrease as baby boomers, which are the largest, well now not anymore, but were the large population as they got older, and they basically didn't see the benefit of educating because their kids were already educated, and also because of other demographic changes, right? The students started becoming black and brown, and that population was largely white, and they didn't want to necessarily support that. That, to me, is what drove up debt. I could imagine the same scenario happening in European countries as pressure on public financing perhaps goes down in education.
Just to quickly come back, I assumed that myself, I have to admit, that would be something that would be addressed or would start to happen in the European environment, but until now I haven't necessarily seen that. In fact, I've seen a lot of recommitment back to state-funded education. So I guess that's why I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe you're right, maybe it doesn't happen that way, and maybe we need to think of other drivers for this.
I mean, the other thing that, and then I'll move on to the other question. I mean, the other thing that could potentially do this is when there's questions about the value or the return on investment. This is something that's really happened in the US since the 2008 recession, is we see a much more of a push by policymakers and by the public in what does this get me, right? We don't go to university anymore to learn something, which is really depressing. We go there, it's a transaction. It's a transaction to get a job. And that has put a lot of pressure on universities in the US to kind of rethink who they educate and how they educate them. And I'm not quite sure that's a great movement, but that's another market force that can happen.
Yeah, I suppose you could look at the research funding side of this as well, and that being potentially a driver of cost and cost shifting and whatnot. We've gone right here, down low.
Right there.
Yeah.
Right here.
Raise your
a couple
hand
more.
again. Raise your
Wave your hand, and a woman right here with the.
There you go.
Right there.
Sarah Medina from Portugal. I work for an organization called SPI. It's a consulting company on science, technology, and innovation. You mentioned the importance of the soft skills in terms of the job market.
Yeah.
Do you have any views on the difference on that, comparing the situation in the USA with Europe and also Southeast Asia and also Australia and New Zealand, for instance?
Around the soft skills?
Yes, the importance of the soft skills in the job market.
I mean, from what again, this is from the research that I did with mostly global organizations that do hiring. They've told me that they have not, this is an issue worldwide, that they have seen this issue, and I think a lot of it goes back to creativity in schools. It goes back to much more scripted and prescripted curricula in schools that don't allow for a lot of student choice and don't allow for a lot of self-directed learning. I mean, that's what really worries me, is this idea that if we are moving into a future where people are going to have multiple jobs, multiple careers, multiple occupations, or in some cases are going to be working for themselves as entrepreneurs or as freelance employees, you would need a lot of self-directional skills, and we are not graduating enough students who have that agency to kind of direct their own lives, right? They're constantly waiting for somebody else to direct their lives for them. And that, to me, is a problem not just in the US, but around the world.
Yeah.
And it's a problem, unfortunately, that you in higher education are stuck with, but that starts much earlier and is not your responsibility. It's the responsibility of the schools and the parents that lead up to you.
So I saw two more hands. If we're real quick, we can get those two in.
Yeah, I'll make these big, quick answers.
The last two here.
I never liked coming between drinks and food.
Ahmet from Middle East Technical University, Ankara. Why do you think education, especially higher education, is so conservative when compared to everything else? Now, if you look at the education, I mean, university education for 1,000 years, we saw today, for example, Bologna University and others. I mean, the things that we observed, the changes that we observed in 1,000 years, why didn't we observe in education?
Okay, so I'll give you an answer, and then I'll tell you why in some ways it's not bad either, that it's somewhat conservative. There's this herd mentality in education. We we come to conferences like this because we want to know what everyone else is doing, right? And so we follow kind of the path of least resistance. We follow the slowest member of what we do, right? In the U.S., I always describe this. I tour a lot of campuses, and everyone always wants to show me off what Cameron now is going to want to show me, this Blockcert thing or this blockchain thing, right? And I'll go to it, and it'll be off in a corner. We'll travel off to the corner of campus. They'll show me this most innovative thing they're doing, and they'll show me the 5 students who are being affected by it. And then when I ask them, well, if this is so great, why is it only serving 5 students or 10, or that's an exaggeration, obviously. They'll say, well, we can't be too different than who we're competing with or who we want to be, right? And I think this is not only a phenomenon in the US, I think it's a phenomenon around the world, and we also look to each other too in that way. So that's why I think that's the number one reason why I think it's conservative. But second, I think we shouldn't move with the whims of everything here, right? The reason why colleges and universities around the world have been around for centuries, as opposed to basically every other entity except for probably the church. Governments change, everything else changes, is because they are conservative, right? And they move slowly, right? And we shouldn't move with I hear so often when I go to conferences or I speak with trustees and other policymakers, they always say, I wish higher education could be more like business. I don't think that's a good idea, because businesses come and go, industries come and go, and I'm not quite sure we want to follow that with higher ed. So we'll take one more question, and I'll be quick on it.
Back behind you, Hajar.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Robinson from Kansas State University, so from your side of the pond. And I want to thank you again for being here. Generally, from our little corner of the world, we tend to absolutely agree with what you've said relative to the crisis in America and the public's trust. Where I tend to not be as optimistic about the future is in collaboration. Mm-hmm. We believe in it, we say we need to do it, but we have largely ignored it at all levels. You know, you have the faculty outcry that, you know, we're not going to adapt. We've existed for this long without it. We just need the public to understand the value. And so my question is, how do we avoid a hollowing out of institutions where we're not able to refill positions and largely are, you know, losing the assets internally to get folks to understand that they do need to collaborate? How do we create that?
Yeah, so I just tend to be an optimistic person by nature. So I think, again, because higher education has been around for centuries, it's not going to suddenly disappear. I think collaboration has been tough. I think collaboration, particularly in the US, has been kind of a thing since the 70s and hasn't really moved. Here's why I think it's different this time. One are these market forces, right? It's going to force universities to make a decision. We either stay in business the way we are, or we go out of business the way we are, or we stay in business by working with others. And I think, and we're already seeing this in the US, there's something called the University Innovation Alliance, which is a group of, and I think, is it Kansas State or Kansas, right?
State.
Yeah, I thought so. Kansas State is a part of it, right? So we have these 11 public universities working together to solve a problem. In this case, the problem is, how do we increase access for low-income students? We're now starting to see the development of these collaborations in the US, where it's not designed around geography. A lot of collaborations probably in your countries are designed, well, we're all co-located near each other, so let's work together, right? Or we're all similar types of research universities, so let's work together. It was always around what type of place we are or where we're located. Now we see universities coming together to solve a specific and common problem they all have, and it's working. And I can see this being replicated in the US at least, and I think around the world, and that to me is going to be the breakthrough, where they say the only way we solve X is to work with others. Instead of trying to boil the ocean and try to do everything, they're working on this one specific problem.
Wow. Jeff, thanks.
Thanks.
you. Can we get a hand for Jeff
Thank you,
Selingo
everybody.
again, everybody?